Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to another tutorial. In this video we're going to take a look on how to create this little slider for our testimonials. This is a really simple slider and it's all in vanilla JavaScript and just a couple of lines of CSS. So enjoy the tutorial. This episode is brought to you by SkySilk. If you're looking for a free Linux-based VPS in the cloud, go to skysilk.com. No strings attached. Just awesome stuff. So this is what we're dealing with. In the previous lesson, we just created a really simple WP query post loop to print all the testimonials that have been approved and featured by an administrator, in our case, just myself. So the first thing that I want to do, I want to create some custom classes and wrap this content around proper containers, proper HTML markup, then style that HTML markup to resemble that slider that I showed you before, and then generate the proper JavaScript in order to animate everything. And throughout this tutorial, we're gonna just use three files: the slider.php, the slider.scss, and the slider.js, which it's not confusing at all. Like all three files, they're called slider, and we know that are meant to be used just for the slider. So let's start with the slider.php. The first thing that we need to do, we need to create a couple of custom classes that we're gonna use to style and then select these elements via JavaScript. And of course, you are free to follow my tutorials, you are free to check my source code on GitHub, but you also are free to name these classes and the structure of the HTML markup however you want. You're not limited to this. You can do literally whatever you want, but let's get started. First, let's create a div that is gonna contain everything, and let's close it immediately so we're not gonna make any mistake. And I already did it, so the div is outside the UL. The first div has a class called AC that stands for Alicat. I want to give it a little prefix in order to avoid to name this class or use this class that already exists in the user website. And then it's gonna be called slider -- wrapper. And in CSS, usually the -- stands for like as a modifier, as an extension of a main class. So if that we have a wrapper called AC slider, then we can have a -- wrapper, a -- container, a -- item, and so on. We're gonna use this methodology because it's kind of easier, especially for this sort of like complicated structure that we're gonna create. But let's continue. So now that we have our global wrapper that we can style and encapsulate the slider, we can create this slider container that is going to have a position relative, and then the UL is going to slide and have the transformation. So let's duplicate the div here. And I'm gonna write everything in line. If you get confused, you can potentially go on another line. It's not a mistake, but it's always better to have everything in one line. It's pretty easy. Like, we shouldn't get too lost. But this is gonna be the AC slider container. And then let's close this div once again. And then another div, because this is gonna be the final one that needs to render the proper view of the slider section. So just visualizing this section and the area where one single slide or single element is visible, we're gonna call it AC slider -- view. So these are the modifiers. Then in the UL, no classes, we need to specify no classes at all. And let's close the div once again here. And then let's update the class. So first, let's assign the class to the list element. And this class is gonna be AC -- slider -- view _ slides. And also here, if you want, you can keep it consistent and have like a double underscore. It's totally up to you. It's totally like a matter of style. But yeah, let's go with the double underscore. So -- double underscore view. And this is another like extension modifier of the view attribute of this class. And then we can change a bunch of things. So first, let's wrap around also the title with a paragraph tag. So we're gonna have the title and the content on two different lines. And the first paragraph is gonna be, actually I want the testimonial first and then the name of the author after the testimonial. So these can be something like testimonial - quote, that can be a quote. And then let's copy this class and put in the other paragraph, and this can be testimonial - author. So here we need to transfer the content that is the actual quote of the testimonial here in the testimonial quote. And here we have the author, and we want to print the author, but the author is not get the title, because get the title is just a custom title that we generate. We have the author name in a meta tag, like in a meta key that we saved per post. So now we need to tap that meta key. And just as a placeholder to avoid that my PHP fixer keeps shouting at me, I'm gonna set a variable called name, but we want to populate this variable name with the meta key author name that we have in our testimonial custom meta option that we saved. So let's tap that meta key. Let's define a variable called name, and the variable is gonna be basically identical. We can copy paste what we have from the testimonial controller, but we can simply use the get underscore post underscore meta option of WordPress, and the get post meta as a first parameter we need to pass the ID. And to get the ID inside a post loop, you should already know this if you've been following me for a long time. So it's the method get the ID that is gonna return, not echo, but return the ID of the current post in the post loop. Then the second parameter is the name of the meta key. In our case, we started with underscore, and it's alicad underscore testimonial underscore key. And then the third parameter is just the serialization option that we want to set to true. And we have these, and actually let's do something like this. Data, and the name, it's equal to the data array, because we are storing everything in an array, but with the attribute. We want to just tap the attribute name. So now we have this, and if we go back in our front end and we refresh, now we have the post content that is actually the quote, and then the name of the author, Jack, Dave, and Alex. That's perfect, but we're not considering a couple of things. First, we're not considering the fact that we are creating two variables inside a post loop every time, and the first one is kind of useless. We can avoid it because PHP is fantastic. So since the data is actually carrying around this get post meta, and we are tapping the array key called name of this array, we can just simply do like this. Let's cut the name attribute and let's put it right after the get post meta. So now we can name this variable directly. And if we go back here and we refresh, still works, nothing's broken, that's perfect, that's the beauty of PHP. But then another thing could happen, that the user doesn't submit the name, or during the submission and the storing on this meta value, something goes wrong and we don't have these meta name attribute in the meta key, and if we're tapping these automatically without checking if it exists, we're gonna have a PHP error. So we can use ternary operation in order to avoid to have issues. So you know the shorthand if statement, we can have like if something exists here, then question mark, the first option, column, the second option. So if this is true, we get this, otherwise we get that. But since this, the get post meta, is the value of the array that we want to get, we can avoid to have the first, the positive, like if this is true response, because it would be just a repetition of this line, and we can completely remove this and remove also the column and set a double question mark. So with a double question mark, we're saying to PHP, hey, if this thing exists, use it. Otherwise, use this empty string. And this is fantastic because automatically this double question mark also takes care of setting an is_set. Is like if we were putting is_set, but is_set returns true. We don't want these to return true. These will return the array, so we can use the double question mark. It's gonna take care of everything. Perfect. Let's save it. Let's double check once again if it works. Still working. Nothing is broken. Fantastic. Let's continue. If we want, we can be a bit fancy. We can wrap this get content around double quotes and maybe the testimonial name around tildes or something like that, but you can style it wherever you want. You can put SVGs here, you can use like pseudo element, but yeah, this is a good starting point in terms of like rendering the content, which is what we wanted. Another thing that I want to do, I want to start generating the HTML content for the left and right arrow that the user can click right after here, and then of course assigning some classes and styling in CSS. So let's do it right after the first div that gets closed, because we want to write our arrows, we want to put them inside the container. So we are inside the div class wrapper, and then the container, and then the slider view. Right after the UL, we have the closing of the slider view, and here we want to write our arrows. So let's write a container that contains all our arrows. And let's generate a div once again with the class ac-slider -arrows, that is the modifier. That's perfect. And let's close immediately this div, or otherwise we're gonna get confused. And here we can print just two span element. The first span can have a class called arrow, just really simple. Then ac-slider the arrows modifier, and then the double underscore the left secondary option of this arrow. And then we can close the span. And then we can duplicate this and use this as underscore right. And in here, in these two span, you can write whatever you want. And actually, let's remember to close this span because we don't want to open double span, too much span. But anyway, in here, you can write whatever you want. You can put an emoji, you can put like an SVG or whatever. What I like to do, I like to use the ASCII code of the right, like bigger than and smaller than signs, because it's kind of like easily renderable. So I copied this code from a website, and you can find the link of the website in the description below, where you can get the Unicode of the element that we're gonna print. But if we save and we check in the website and we refresh, that's what we're printing. This is the Unicode for the smaller than and bigger than sign, and I'm gonna use this. Of course, you're totally free to even use images or use SVGs, whatever you want, just font icons, just put whatever you want in there. Just for the ease of use and the ease of tutorial, I'm just gonna use this Unicode, so I don't have to integrate anything particular. Okay, perfect. Now we have our starting structure, and of course, because I already know how the slider will work, I wanna just do another thing that can sound confusing right now. But basically what it's gonna happen, all these elements, these li elements, whatever there's a dot, this is like container li element, they're gonna be all hidden basically, except for the first one. And in order to identify which one should be visible, we need an active class, or the usual isActive type of class. And we need to apply, whenever we generate the page in the post loop for the first time, we need to apply this unique class active to the first element. So inside the post loop, we need to check if that's the first element, just assign the isActive class, if we want to call it like that. So as usual, like we love to do in these tutorials, let's generate a variable called $I that is going to be equal to 1. Let's make a little bit of space so it's not getting too cramped in here. Okay, and inside the post loop here, right before the ending of the end while, we can increase the $I variable 1. So in the first loop, the $I is going to be equal to 1, the second loop 2, and the third loop 3, and so on. So now here, in the declaration of the classes, we can have an inline if statement directly in the echo to check if the $I is equal to 1, print the isActive class. So the first slide is going to be active. And we can do this directly in line, as I said. So let's interrupt the single quotes of the echo and then concatenate directly an if statement, a shorthand if statement. And to concatenate a shorthand if statement inside an echo, you need to wrap it around the regular brackets or parentheses, however you want to call it. Otherwise, it won't work. So let's say that if $I it's identical, equal, or we can say even identical with 3 equal signs to the number 1 question mark, we can print and give it a space is-active. Otherwise, just print nothing, and that's it. If we go back in our front end, we refresh and we check the source code. Now only the first li has the class isActive. That's what we wanted. Okay, now it's time to style this thing with a little bit of SCSS. And SCSS is nothing special. So I'm gonna copy the code that I already have and paste it here. You can grab this code already ready for you, ready-made for you in the GitHub repository. I already updated the GitHub repository with lesson 51, which is the current one, and you can grab this source code. So you can just copy the CSS, the slider.scss file, paste it here, and remember always to compile with gulp, and then you should have a situation like me. Let's refresh. That's the slider. Look at that. Look how beautifully styled it is. And of course, if I try to click, it doesn't work because we don't have anything JavaScript related. I prepared the CSS before because I didn't want to spend time in just styling this thing, because you can literally style this thing however you want. Just let's continue and let's jump to the juicy part, which is the slider.js. This is gonna be pretty awesome. First, we can safely remove the event listener DOM content loaded, because this script is not gonna auto trigger itself. It's gonna be triggered by a person, so we don't need to wait that the DOM is loaded before using our JavaScript. And we have to do, in order to generate a slider, or at least that's what I like to do, you can literally generate and create a JavaScript slider in, I don't know, hundreds different ways. It doesn't really matter. This is how I like it to do, and this is a pretty straightforward system that works in pretty much every browser. So if you find a better method, go for it, but this is my method. What I like to do, I like to define some global variables. Then I want to define the sliding function, that is the function that is going to actually slide the different slides, the different list element. Then I want to define a before sliding function, and the before sliding function is gonna basically take care of checking if we are at the last slide or the first slide, and we have to reverse it. We have to go back to the first one. We have to quickly switch to the last one. It's gonna double check before actually sliding. It's gonna check the direction of the sliding. And then I want to find the triggers for the arrows. So whenever the user clicks on the arrow, something is gonna happen. Okay, let's start with the global variables. These are not really global variables because they're not accessible everywhere, like it's just in this file. But because these variables don't need to be changed, we don't want the script to update these variables, because these are strict variables that we're gonna use throughout our JavaScript methods. We can define these variables as constant. And this is a particular thing of es6. You have the constant variable and the let variable that basically they replace the usual var, and the constant is a variable that you cannot update. So let's create a variable slider view that is going to equal be equal to document.query selector, and we know we have just one class of this, and the query selector it's equal to ac-slider-view, and we want to tab the unordered list container. We don't want the slider view, we want just the UL inside the slider view. Now we need to declare another constant variable, and instead of doing this, like semicolon and write again constant, another variable, another document, okay, another document select, blah blah, we can continue by declaring or writing comma and then going on another line or continuing on the same line. I'm gonna go on another line just to be cleaner, but the constant is gonna continue to be assigned to all the other variables that we are declaring. So the next one is slider view slides, which is gonna get all the slides that are inside, so all the elements that have a specific class, in our case document query selector all, in this case because we're tapping multiple elements, and the class is AC slider --view with the double underscore slides to get them all, then comma, another variable called arrow left that is basically just the left arrow. Makes sense, right? So document query selector, just a single one, we have only one left arrow. The unique class is AC slider --arrows underscore left. Then we can duplicate this line, put a comma, and instead of arrow left, let's say arrow right, and this is the arrows underscore right. And then the last one is the slider length that we need to calculate, and we need to identify to see how many slides do we have inside here. And the slider length, it's identical to this very own variable that we already declared, but we need to tab because this is going to be an array, multiple slides. We need to tap the length of this array and a semicolon at the end. That's perfect. Now we have all these variables, and of course, because our gulp watch is running, if we make some mistake, the gulp watch will interrupt the execution of the script. We didn't do any mistake. If we tap the front end, we refresh, we don't have any console log, which is fantastic. That's what we want. Of course, the slider still doesn't work. Now, first, I want to create the triggers for the arrows, because now we have the arrow left and arrow right. So I want to say to my script that whenever someone clicks on one of these two, we need to trigger a specific method. So let's say that the arrow right, whenever someone, and that's at an event listener that triggers itself on click. And on click, we're going to use the arrow function, because if we don't use the arrow function, this is going to get triggered on page load. We don't want that. Let's tap a function called before sliding that we're going to declare here, a before sliding function. And to the before sliding function, I want to pass a specific variable. So this is right. We're going to the right, so we are increasing. I want to pass a number 1. And now it feels confusing, but it's gonna make sense after, don't worry. Now let's duplicate this line and say that the arrow left, also on click, we're gonna tap the before sliding, but because we're going negative, we are giving a 0, so we don't increase anything. Just bear with me for a couple of minutes. Okay, now let's do the before sliding function. We're going in reverse because I'm an idiot, it's fine. But before sliding, we need to check a bunch of things, calculate if we have actually the slide, and then trigger the sliding method in the direction that we want. So before sliding, let's declare these. It's a method, this is a function. What we used to do before in JavaScript to create a function was something like function before sliding and then opening and close the curly brackets. This is like pretty standard. Now we can use with es6, we can declare a variable that contains that function, so we can tap that function as a variable and pass all the information that we want, which is pretty fantastic. So we can say that the constant before sliding, it's equal to, and we can use arrow functions because we're super cool. And in the before sliding, we're passing a variable. So let's call also this variable the I variable, that it stands for integer. And we can say these, like, let's console log this I element and see if it actually works. Let's refresh. And if we click on the right, we get the 1. If we click on the left, we get the 0. That's perfect. That's what we wanted. So here what we're doing is basically identical of writing function and then the curly brackets. But because we're using es6, we can avoid to write the word function and use the arrow function. And also because we're not passing multiple parameters, multiple attributes to this method, we can also avoid the parentheses or the regular brackets and just pass the I variable, or expect this method to receive the I variable. So if we refresh this page, and we tap it once again, 1, and here on the left it's 0. Still works. This is beautiful. ES6 is so clean and easy to understand, right? Okay, now inside here we need to define a bunch of variables that are gonna check for which slide is currently active, check if we have the next slide or the slide before if it exists, and then trigger the sliding function. So because I'm gonna call these function multiple times based on how many times the user clicks on one of the arrows, all the variables that I declare inside, they cannot be constant variables because are gonna be updated. They need to be updated. So all these variables are gonna be let variables, so updatable. First, let's define a variable called isActiveItem, which basically is gonna tab the document once again and query select only the slide that has the isActive class that we defined before on the first slide. So let's tab the AC-slider-view modifier and the slides sub modifier that also has an is-active class. And we know that it's going to be just the first one. Then another variable, comma, once again, let's go on another line. It's going to be the current item variable. The current item variable, we need to have the index of the current slider. So we know that here we have the slider view slides, that it's an array with all the slides. We need to know the index of that specific slide, which slide is the currently activated. And in order to find the index, we can use a method of JavaScript that taps the array. So we say, hey, this array starting from this very own array that we have here, the slider view slides, from this array, get me the index of this active item. And this is gonna return an integer. It's gonna return 0, 1, or 2, depending of whatever position we have. And because the before sliding, it's used by both right and left, and when we go right, we need to increase +1. When we go left, we don't need to increase it because we're specifying the location that we are and we're going left. Now that's where the I variable that we're passing, 1 or 0, gets handy. So we can add it directly to the variable. So now this is gonna be, hey, the current index of this is 0. If we're going right, the current index or the current item is gonna be 1. If we're going left, the current item is gonna be 0 because 0 plus 0 is 0. And this I variable makes this before sliding method dynamic and usable for both left and right. Now we need to check for the next item, so we can say, hey, the next item, that is the one that we wanna activate and we wanna make visible, is gonna be equal to the current item plus the I. So if this is still 0, this is not gonna change. So the current item is still the last one that we are here, or we're going back. But if we have more item after it, we're gonna also add more. So if the current item index of this thing is, for example, 1 is the first, we want the next item to be 2. So we're gonna go on the next slide. And to check if the actual slide exists, we can say that another variable, the slider view items, is going to be equal to the document and then query selector. And we want to select once again these AC slider view. Let's remove the active because we don't want to select the active. We want to select this slide that has this class, but also that is a specific nth child of CSS. So we can put a column and then nth child, because everything, all these slides is one after another, so we can tap the nth child, the location of the first, the second, the last, or whatever. The nth child is gonna be equal to the next item, that it's an integer, and that's it. Semicolon at the end. Perfect. Now we can do a bunch of checks. Oh, first, let's see if we broke something. No, JavaScript still running, no problem. If we refresh here, nothing happens. The no console logs error, and of course the methods, they don't generate the console log because we remove it, but if we click, nothing happens. Okay, let's continue. Now that we have all these fancy variables, we can do a bunch of statements. So the first statement is gonna be that if the next item is bigger than the number of slides that we have available, then the next check is if the next item is 0, that means that we're going back in time. So we're not tapping to the right, but we're on the first slide and we're tapping to the left, and that's it. And then the last thing that we have to do is trigger the sliding method. So let's do it. The first if statement is pretty straightforward. So we can say that if the next item, because we have all these variables that we define, the next item is bigger than the slider length, that is the length of the array of all the slides. So we can check this. If this is bigger of the slider length, it means that we reached the last slide and the user clicked right again and is trying to go again to the right, but we don't have another slide. So we need to update these slider view items, and instead of checking the next item child, which if we have 3 slides, this is going to be 4, but we don't have the 4 nth child, we can update these variable and say that, hey, if this is bigger than the actual amount, this one should go back to the first nth child, which is number 1. Then the other check if, and this is even simpler, if the next item it's identical to 0. That means that the user is looking at the first slide, that it's the active one, and then it clicks on the left slide and it tries to go back. But the next item before the current one that it starts at 1 is 0. So we don't have a 0. We need to go to the last one. So we can once again update these, and actually let me grab this here, update these, the slider view items, and say instead of going to the nth child 1 or the next slide, go to the nth child that is identical to the slider length. So it's the number of all the slides, and it's gonna be the number of the final slide, the position of the final slide. Now that we check these two options, if we are sliding right on the last one or we're sliding left on the first one, we can trigger the sliding method. And the sliding method can be called however you want. I'm gonna call it like slide me, something like that. And the slide me method, we need to pass all the variables that we define. So the slider view items, the isActive item, and then the current item. All these three we need to pass in a specific order. So the first one is the slider view items that we're updating here. Then the second one is the isActive item, and the third one is the current item. Also, just a little information, because we're writing es6, we can also avoid this concatenation with the plus whenever we want to print a variable inside a JavaScript string. We can use the backticks, and the backticks are really great because we can use backticks and wrap everything around a backtick like it was a single quote. But then when we want to print a JavaScript variable, we can simply use the $sign and then the curly brackets, and then closing that variable with the curly brackets. So these, it's kind of like ES6 way, and some users or some developers don't find it elegant. They prefer to use the plus sign to concatenate, but it's a preference. It doesn't really matter. So we can change also these and replace the slider length with next item and use proper ES6 with the backticks. But it's really up to you. It's not better or worse. It's just a different type of writing this thing. So now we can create the slide me method and pass all of these things. So let's copy this string actually, and let's scroll up to the sliding function comment, and let's say that the constant variable slide me, it's equal to, and now because we're passing multiple variables, multiple attributes to this method, we need to wrap it around the brackets or the parentheses. And here also we can use the arrow function to print everything. So this slide me method has to do a bunch of things. Has to update the classes, and then CSS transform the active slide position, and it's gonna be pretty straightforward. So first, we are expecting the isActive item, that is the first one, the current item that is active. So we already know right off the bat that the isActive item, we need to remove the isActive class, because this is not anymore the active one that we want to visualize. So this is active, remove this. Then we need to add the active class to the new element. It's going to be the slider view items. As you can see here, the slider view items is the one that is going to get the next item, so the nth child, or is going to get visualized based on if the first one or the last one. So we need to update these, the slider view item, and in the class list, add the class isActive. Then we can try and see if the slider works. So in order to animate the slider, we're gonna set the style transform attribute and offset the translate x attribute equal to the offset of that specific item. So if the first item is a 0 location, so it starts from the left, the offset is going to be 0. But if the item that we want to visualize is the second one, so is on the left, is to the left on the first one, is going to have an offset left of like a couple of hundred pixels, and we can slide by that. So let's say that we want to tap the slider view, that finally we're using this variable that we declare here, that is the container UL element. We can say, hey, to this slider variable, set an attribute. And to set an attribute, we can set style. We can set up a bunch of attributes, whatever we want. But I want to just to set the style attribute. And I want to say here that the transform property should update the translate x. And the translate x should be negative to a specific pixel value. And as I said, the pixel value, it's equal to these slider view items, but let's tap the offset left of these slider new items, and then of course specify the pixel here in the string. Let's save it. Let's check our goal file. Nothing went wrong. Let's check our front end, refresh, and if we click to the right, sliding to the right, and you can see in the element here, the transform translate has a negative 301 because this second one, it has an offset of 301 pixels from the beginning of the UL. If we do it again, perfect. If we do it again, we are at the last one. Boom, it slides all the way back to the first one. And if we do the same, if we slide to the left on the first one, it slides all the way to the last. So we have a sort of like simulating an infinite carousel. That of course with 3 is kind of like janking in your face, but it works and it's just pure JavaScript. And I guess here we don't need the current item at all. I don't know why I wanted the current item, so we can remove the current item from here. That's perfect. So this is pretty much it for this episode. I know it was a pretty long episode, but we built an entire JavaScript slider with just es6 methods without relying on any third-party framework or third-party library. We are not using jQuery. Our slider is super light and it works pretty perfectly. Thank you so much for watching, and I talk to you in the next one.